Hi, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most important arguments that Buddhists give for the theory of no self. The Buddhist theory of no self is the theory that there is nothing more to you or me or anyone else than just five things. These five things are called skandhas, and you could think of them, for example, you could think of that word as meaning, for example, something like particulars, and that will come out a little bit more in when I actually name them and identify them. The five skandhas or particulars are body, feelings like pleasure or pain, perception, volition, and consciousness. Volition being something like will, intention, something to that effect. But volition is the most precise word to use. Again, to name them, they are body, feelings such as pleasure or pain, perception, volition, which means something like will or intention, and consciousness. The Buddha's theory of no self says that the self, or what you think to be the self, is nothing other than these five things. There's nothing more to you than just being a bundle or a collection of these five things. One important entailment of this theory is that there's no immortal soul, so there's not going to be an afterlife where you persist or survive because there's no you to begin with, right? There's just your body, your feelings, your perception, your volition, and your consciousness. Another important entailment of this theory is that despite what you might believe, there's no essence to you. There's no essence to you besides these five things. So there's nothing that makes you you, is perhaps the best way to put it. And that flies in the face of our usual experience of the world and of ourselves. For example, when I cut my fingernails, I might say that I've changed something about me, but I haven't actually changed my underlying essence. And the Buddha's theory of no self is designed to challenge the very existence of there being such an essence, which again has this entailment that there is no immortal soul, which is perhaps one of the most startling consequences of this theory. There are different arguments that the Buddha gave for this conclusion, or that Buddhists have developed for this conclusion. One of the most famous is the argument from impermanence, which is the idea that all of the five things we've mentioned, all of the five skandhas, these particular things that make you up, that make up you, that since all five of them are fleeting, impermanent, transient, and so on, that you yourself are just an impermanent, transient thing, and that there's no actual substantial, persistent over time essence of you. Oh, you might think, for example, of what would be if someone said that you're just your body, which isn't the Buddhist theory, but let's just make an analogy here. Let's say that someone were to claim that you were just your body, and that and then you learned the true scientific fact that every moment, everything about you and your body, everything is changing. So all your cells are dying and being replaced and so on. It would follow from that that there's that you now, to the extent that we can talk about a you at all, you now are a completely different entity than the you that existed when you were 2 months old, for example, because everything about your body has changed between now and then. Um, and that's an important insight is the impermanence of these five skandhas. However, the argument that I want us to dive into today, in much greater detail, is the controller argument. Um, as I said a second ago, one important entailment of this theory is that it denies that there's an immortal soul. So there's no permanent, you have no permanent existence at all, to the extent that we might talk about you existing in the first place. Certainly, we can't talk about you as something that exists over and above or in addition to the five skandhas. But permanence isn't one of the only things we associate with a self. We also associate some amount of executive functioning to the self. It's a common experience that we make plans for ourself. Right, an obvious example would be someone who wants to dye their hair. They think that they're making a plan for themselves. They've thought about something that they want to change about themselves for whatever reason, so they want to change that feature, right? Someone who gets a tattoo would be another example. And so this executive functioning we associate with the self, the ability to identify some feature of ourselves and then change it. And the Buddha uses this very purported alleged feature of the self to show that the self doesn't exist. And we call this argument the controller argument. We need to understand the way this argument works, which again is fundamentally an argument that if we think that executive functioning or controlling the self is a hallmark of selves, then we can rule out the existence of a self by attending to this feature and examining what actually exhibits that feature in us. So one crucial principle here, one crucial premise of the argument is what we call the principle of irreflexibility. The principle of irreflexibility. This had widespread agreement among Indian philosophers, and so it's an especially powerful argument because if we think of this principle as the engine of the argument, well, it's a very powerful engine because it commanded widespread agreement. There was a consensus about the truth of this principle. And the irreflexibility principle says that no matter what you think, no matter what appearances suggest, an entity cannot act on itself. Again, no matter what appearances might suggest, no matter what you think, an entity cannot act on itself. And there are tons of examples we could use to illustrate what makes this principle so appealing to Indian philosophers. After all, a blade can cut other things, but it can't cut itself, right? A nail clipper can clip things, but it can't clip itself, and so on. Now, and of course, we could give so many other examples. Scissors can cut things, but they can't cut themselves. But you might still think that there are some obvious counterexamples, right? What about a doctor, for example, who cures themselves? Well, the Buddhists think that if we look at these alleged counterexamples much more closely, we would see that they don't actually challenge the principle of irreflexibility. The reason for that is that once we analyze these examples closely, these cases closely, we can see that things are not really acting on themselves in these examples. For example, if a doctor is stitching their left arm, the left arm is the thing that's being stitched, and the left arm is not stitching itself, right? It would be the right arm that does the stitching. And even if somehow a person were able to use their left arm to stitch their left arm, which would require a fair degree of contorting your body, but even if we thought that, it wouldn't be precisely the thing that's being stitched on the left arm that's doing the stitching, right? And that's the idea of the principle of irreflexibility, again, that no matter what it seems to you, or no matter what it looks like, something cannot actually act on itself. That's just impossible. And so a doctor can operate on her own toenail, but that's because it isn't the toenail operating on itself. And so the Buddha thinks that as a result, you can't really change a part of yourself. You can't really change a part of yourself. Um, I can change my nose, but that just shows that it really isn't a part of me. So let's talk about why that would be. Okay. So let's say, for example, that you believed that your nose is the thing about you that's the self. You thought your nose was yourself. You studied the self. You came to the conclusion that the part of me that's in charge is my nose. That's who I really am, is my nose. If I cut my fingernails, that's not changing me or who I am. But if I change my nose, that's where I draw the line. That's when I begin to change. Okay. Now again, one hallmark feature of the self is that it engages in executive functioning. It is the thing that's the controller in you. But you change your nose, and the nose cannot act on itself. So, because the principle of irreflexibility says that noses can't act on themselves, that means you cannot be your nose. And in fact, we could do that with any alleged self that you wanted to identify. And the reason for that is that in general, controller cannot be the same as what's being controlled. But that's exactly what's happening when we allege that the nose is the controller. So the experiences we have that we change our nose actually, or we change our noses, actually eliminates the idea that the nose is the self, right? If we change our nose, then the nose cannot be the self. And we could do this with all five of the skandhas and every part of the skandhas. So again, the five skandhas are body, feelings, pleasure, feelings such as pleasure and pain, perception, volition, i.e., will or intention, and consciousness. So we a second ago just zoomed in on the body and said that, well, the body actually can't be the self because there are some times when we ourselves change our bodies. And that means that our bodies can't be the controller because in that situation, the bodies are the things being controlled. And we could do this with all of them, right? For example, you might have the idea that your consciousness is the part of you that is doing the controlling. And so you say, well, my consciousness is myself. My consciousness is myself, and therefore the consciousness is the part of me that's a controller that has executive functioning and so on. But there are times when we change our consciousness. And so if we change our consciousness, then our consciousness cannot be the self. One way we can think about this argument is in terms of the substitution of words. So let's say that you said that that I myself change my consciousness. And then you also said the consciousness was the self. Then you would have to say consciousness changes consciousness, right? Because if we substituted the word I myself, the words I myself, for whatever you thought the self was, then if you ended up with something that violated the principle of irreflexibility, you would have to rule out that candidate for being the self, right? So if I say that I am my consciousness is what I am, then I'm no longer allowed to say I changed my consciousness. But that is something that we do say all the time, and therefore consciousness cannot be the self. The experience we have of changing our consciousness reveals that the consciousness cannot be the self. And therefore, anything that we identify as the self in us, it would turn out isn't really that thing, because isn't really the self, because we could find times when we are changing that thing. And therefore, it cannot be the thing that's in charge of our executive functioning. Now you probably at this point you're a little confused because you're asking yourself, okay, well, if if we have executive functioning, then what's the self? And the Buddha believes that the skandhas are themselves controllers. So, as a matter of fact, the Buddha believes that when we exhibit executive functioning, we are trying to use one skandha to change another, or one part of a skandha to change another part of that skandha. Um, and so the idea is that there's a relationship of what you might call mutual controlling or mutual controllership, and each skandha is trying to control each other skandha when the situation is appropriate for that. So again, we go back to the example of the nose. Someone says, "Well, my nose is myself. That's who I really am. That's who I really am." And then it turns, and then that we find examples where the nose is the thing that's being controlled, which means the nose cannot be the controller, because controller cannot be controlled. At least not in one in the same case. And so then we have what we would say is, well, the body skandha is actually changing another part of the body skandha. So, for example, someone uses their hands to give themselves a nose piercing. That's one part of the scan. That's one part of the nose skandha changing another part. And so we do exhibit executive functioning, but the Buddha believes that the skandhas are changing each other, or changing, but they're, and when they change themselves, that's only because one part of a skandha is actually changing that same part, or changing that other part. So when so skandhas change other skandhas, and when one skandha appears to change itself, it means that one part of that skandha is changing another part of that same skandha. So actually, when we ask, well, what's actually changing the skandhas? The answer is that the skandhas are actually changing each other. And so we are able to exhibit executive functioning in this way. So there's no hidden you in there that's doing the changing, because anything that we find and could identify as the you that's doing the changing is, well, we would just identify it as just another skandha or a part of a skandha. That's the controller argument for the Buddhist theory of no self. Knowing this fact about our identity, that there's nothing more to us than the five skandhas, that executive functioning, which is a hallmark of the self, is actually just displayed by the skandhas changing each other. And anytime we try to identify the skandha that's doing the changing, we can find an example of another time when another skandha is changing that thing. This helps us understand that there's nothing more to you than just the skandhas, and so we can live better as a result of that. There is some amount of our suffering that's caused by the belief that we are real, that we will exist over time and have an afterlife. And because of that, we can create attachments to things, and these attachments give rise to cravings, which in turn gives rise to suffering. And we can eliminate this suffering by eliminating this false belief in the self. At least we can eliminate some amount of suffering by eliminating belief in the self. But that is a subject to be covered in another episode. As for this episode, I'll sum up by saying that we should remember and bear in mind just how much the principle of irreflexibility is working in this argument, that it's because an entity cannot act on itself, that anytime we identify some part of us as allegedly or purportedly ourself, when we find an example of a time when that thing is not in charge but is being controlled, but still we'd say, well, I am changing that thing, that it's because of that principle that such experiences rule out the existence of a self. And that concludes our look at the Buddhist theory of no self and the argument for it, which is called the controller argument, one of many arguments for the theory of no self. Thank you very much.